There is research that suggests that U.S. sanctions have harmed millions and led to a death count that trumps that of most wars of the last 2 decades. Sanctions adversely impact women more than men, the poor, and the disadvantaged. They also have a negative impact on the environment. Let's find out why. Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Michelle, and I want to welcome you to another episode of TAP Talks. And tonight we're going to be talking about the ethics of economic sanctions. I know that we are certainly watching the war between Russia and Ukraine unfold, and there's been a lot of talk about economic sanctions. And so we thought it would be a good idea to talk about sanctions so we can understand the real people as well as financial impact of that strategy. In the Journal of International Security, author Robert Pape described sanctions as a liberal alternative to war. And sanctions by some have been lauded as a plausible way for government to change the behavior of the target and to show the people of the government using the sanctions that they're doing something. So in many ways, it's symbolic. However, there is considerable empirical research and theory that suggests otherwise when we talk about the actual effectiveness. So let's look at the history of sanctions, which can actually be traced back to 1917 with what is known as the Trading with the Enemy Act. And basically, this law gave unbridled power to the executive branch of the United States government to wage war on basically anyone at any time. And then in 1977, we saw various amendments of it through time. But then in 1977, Congress then passed the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which in essence gave the president the right to declare a state of emergency when there was a credible threat to national security, foreign policy, or the economy of the US. So when the UN, when we say the United Nations, imposes a sanction, there has to be widespread agreement from the members of the UN. So for example, the US and the UN right now have sanctions. They have sanctions against North Korea for its nuclear weapons program, but there is no UN sanctions against Venezuela or Syria because of oppositions from China and Russia. So you see that sometimes the UN has the ability to impose sanctions and sometimes they don't. It depends on the members and their support. A trade restriction is designed to change the price that the target government is paid or has to pay for an affected good or service. Financial or economic restrictions are designed to basically create catastrophic longitudinal losses to their gross national product over time.
What if country A is misbehaving geopolitically, causing trouble left and right, thereby making weaker nations feel uneasy? What if country B is misbehaving economically? Anything from devaluing its currency aggressively so as to boost exports, to stealing intellectual property or at least tolerating theft. A few centuries ago, other countries would have been more eager to simply go to war. In our nuclear, mutually assured destruction age, however, let's just say there are more than enough reasons to think twice. As such, a lot of quote-unquote punishments have transitioned from the military to the economic dimension. Economic sanctions can range from a country simply responding symmetrically to the actions of another, to global efforts which revolve around multiple countries essentially isolating another nation economically. Do sanctions work? They can. However, things get tricky if 1. Other nations don't play along for geopolitical reasons. For example, sanctions against North Korea, which don't involve China meaningfully participating, aren't exactly effective. 2. Other nations don't play along for economic reasons. For example, Germany being dependent enough on Russian resources for them to sometimes have economic reasons to think twice before imposing sanctions on Russia. 3. The economy others try to punish is so large that we end up in an economic mutually assured destruction scenario in light of how interconnected everything is nowadays. Those who think it would be a walk in the park to impose sanctions on, let's say, China are deluding themselves. The list could go on and on. The bottom line is this. Economic sanctions can be peaceful and remarkably effective conflict resolution options under the right circumstances. But aspects such as the deeply interconnected nature of our global economy and complex geopolitical as well as economic interests make the equation less than straightforward in most cases.
And there was a landmark study done on sanctions from 1914 to 1990, and they found out that sanctions were only successful 34% of the time. So that's basically a modest impact. So when you hear about a sanction and what it really does, because the whole point of sanctioning is to change some behavior in the target state. And if that's not occurring at a 34% success rate, that makes you wonder of the success of the sanctions. And there's significant data that sanctions actually harm the people.
Today, as we face the coronavirus pandemic, I'm calling for sanctions that may affect the health sector to be eased or suspended. This needs to happen to protect the lives and rights of millions of people and for global public health reasons. The danger is that this will cause further suffering and death and indeed wider contagion across the world. Vulnerable people in these countries are in no way responsible for the policies targeted by the sanctions. Many have been living in a precarious situation for a long time. We urgently need to see broad, practical exemptions for humanitarian reasons. Essential medical equipment and supplies must not be held up by sanctions. It is especially important to protect the health of health workers themselves, and authorities should never punish medical professionals for pointing out deficiencies in the response to the crisis. Countries under sanctions should also be open about what is happening and what they are doing. They should accept offers of vital aid and prioritize the needs and rights of vulnerable people. They should also guarantee that national and international organizations are able to carry out their humanitarian work. It is vital to avoid the collapse of any health system. We need to step up international cooperation and solidarity on this and other issues. At this dangerous time, in this interconnected world, we all rely on each other to hold back the advance of the coronavirus. Impeding medical efforts in one country will heighten the risk for all of us.
You know, they're not really harming the governments as much as they're harming the people. And according to the Centers for Economic and Policy Research, the economic sanctions against Venezuela led to more than 40,000 excess deaths between 2017 and 2018. And while we learned from an earlier broadcast that sanctions typically do not target humanitarian aid like food and medications, the literature tells us otherwise.
And with allies and partners, we've strengthened the global nonproliferation regime, including the cornerstone of our efforts, the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. Now, in the entire world, there is only one signatory to the NPT, only one, that has been unable to convince the International Atomic Energy Agency that its nuclear program is for peaceful purposes. One nation, and that nation is Iran. For years, the Iranian government has violated its commitments, defied the United Nations Security Council resolutions, and forged ahead with its nuclear program, all while supporting terrorist groups and suppressing the aspirations of the Iranian people. Since taking office, I've made it clear that the United States was prepared to begin a new chapter of engagement with the Islamic Republic of Iran. We offered the Iranian government a clear choice. It could fulfill its international obligations and realize greater security, deeper economic and political integration with the world, and a better future for all Iranians. Or it could continue to flout its responsibilities and face even more pressure and isolation. To date, Iran has chosen the path of defiance. And that's why we have steadily built a broader and deeper coalition of nations to pressure the Iranian government. Last month, we joined with our partners at the UN Security Council to pass the toughest and most comprehensive multilateral sanctions that the Iranian government has ever faced.
We found in the Iranian sanctions that there were medication shortages, which had a significant impact on people who had chronic diseases such as, multiple sclerosis, cancer, hemophilia, and asthma. You can't get medications because the supply chain is disrupted. That negatively impacts the health of your citizens. And sanctions also have a significant impact on mental health. They actually did a study of the Iranian sanctions, and actually these sanctions affected women and minorities by far more than anyone else. They triggered more inpatient admissions for depression, substance abuse related disorders, and suicide. And you say, why? Well, when a target government is sanctioned, it's deprived of financial resources and or global support over their overall way of doing business. So their overall economy suffers. And this leads to unemployment and housing instability, which of course leads to depression and frustration, mental health, potential suicide. So that's what happens in an area when significant sanctions are imposed. So when we're looking at the Russian-Ukraine conflict, we have seen sanctions, basically targeted sanctions, targeting the elite. But what we need to understand is that when rich people suffer, poor people suffer more. And research shows that economic sanctions increase poverty and inequality in the target government. So let's look at the conflict between Italy and Ethiopia. In 1935, Italy, under the leadership of Benito Mussolini, invaded Ethiopia. And Ethiopia at the time was the only independent nation in Africa. So while the world is familiar with the atrocities committed in Hitler's Nazi Germany, we know that similar atrocities were committed during this invasion. The people of Ethiopia were gassed, they were burned, mustard gas was used, they were burned, and they were placed in concentration camps. And Black outrage swept across the globe as the world basically was watching the slaughter of the people of Ethiopia. Black citizens all over the world mobilized and offered direct assistance in terms of aid to the people of Ethiopia. And why was this notable in the US? Because it was 1935, and that was the year of the Great Depression. So over 2 tons of medical supplies were sent from Harlem to Ethiopia, and leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, A. Philip Randolph were all quoted as renouncing the invasion of Ethiopia by Mussolini's army. It is estimated that over 700,000 Ethiopians died because of that conflict. Mussolini would eventually be captured and court-martialed. He was placed before a firing squad, basically for the murder, degradation, and genocide of over 700,000 Ethiopians. He was shot by a firing squad, and he was hung up by his heels. And basically here you see the dead bodies of Mussolini, his mistress, and other executed fascists. They were actually had their bodies placed on display in Milan in 1945. At that time, what is now the United Nations was called the League of Nations, and the League of Nations had voted to sanction Italy. Well, Italy responded to that sanction by basically leaving the League of Nations. That's what they did. And then they turned around and just made a deal with the UK and France, which basically allowed Italy to continue to operate its ports. So they were still able to receive goods, they were able to ship goods. And eventually, Italy would defeat Ethiopia, which at the time was called Abyssinia. And ultimately, the sanctions were a colossal failure because the League of Nations proved their inability to prevent aggression from a hostile nation. And it should be noted that the United States never even joined the League of Nations, so that didn't give it a lot of credibility. And then it was abolished in 1946. Okay, in the US versus Cuba conflict in 1960, the US had basically placed an embargo on all the exports in Cuba in response to their decision to nationalize US property. And meaning basically the government decided, hey, we own everything. There's no private interest from the US here. Everything that's in our country is owned by our country. So since 1992, the UN has actually passed resolutions insisting that the US end this economic embargo of Cuba, which has basically gone on for some time. And as of 2018, the US has continued to enforce their embargo under its Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917. So the US is basically saying, we have the power and the ability through our laws to continue this embargo.
General McCaffrey, you mentioned that, I liked your statement that we've truncated and minimized our access to that regime and the people in that regime. And certainly that's been my experience there. We have no idea who the people in waiting are there, and that's a bit troubling. But one thing that we always hear is we can't engage with a country, or we can't allow Americans to travel to a country that is one of our listed state sponsors of terrorism. Does that give you any pause in making the recommendations that you've made to lift the embargo or whatnot? Should we be doing that to some country that has been identified as a state sponsor of terrorism?
Yeah, I think there's still, 7 nations on state sponsors of terrorism, and it's something that the Cuba piece of it, I think, is 80 words, or very cryptic, because there's probably no current reality to that at all. I think in past years you could have made that argument 25 years ago. They were an active threat. They had 250,000 troops in Africa. They were very aggressively, with covert agents, trying to foment revolutions around the Americas, but I don't think that's the case any longer. I cannot imagine the Cubans realistically being a threat to our national security interests in the short run. Now, having said that, again, I think Mr. Peters makes a good point. You know, we ought to have a dialogue with them with our eyes wide open. But clearly, 5 years from today, if we don't know who the one-star generals and the battalion commanders and the key intelligence officers are in Cuba, we have harmed our own ability to protect the interests of the American people. We got to get down there and engage with them. We ought to have influence. We ought to give them something to prize as opposed to merely withholding things from their society. And it seems to me, again, the downside risk is almost non-existent.
Mr. Pignon, it's often said as well that we somehow lend legitimacy to the regime if we take action to engage them on issues of national security or drug interdiction or migration. Can you comment on that? Do we somehow lend legitimacy to that regime?
You know, I come from the private sector, and early on I learned from a former boss of mine that when you read it in the front page of the Wall Street Journal, it's too late. And so I believe in early engagement. Early engagement somehow gets misdirected. I mean, we're talking about conversations. We're talking about dialogue at different levels. I was just in Cuba 3 weeks ago. I was there at the time of the baseball game between Cuba and Japan. And let me tell you, people in the street want to engage you. They do want to talk. They want to talk about the U.S. They want to talk about President Obama. So I think the fear of engagement, the fear of conversation, particularly in the case of Cuba, there is really no justification for not having it.
Right. Mr. Mr. Peters, do you have any comment on that, on as far as the legitimacy argument? Is it a moot point after 50 years, if the regime is in place, that we would somehow lend legitimacy to it, or
I don't know
because
that's
that is often brought up, I can tell you, among in Congress here. It's should we lend legitimacy to that regime at this point?
Well, that seems to me to be a diplomatic issue that would be raised in the very early months of a government such as Cuba's, when there's doubt as to whether it's going to hang on or not. But we're quite a bit past that point, and I don't think that issue or any of the variations of it that imply that Cuba is on the brink, and that whether we engage or not is going to change the equation in a decisive way. I don't think any of those arguments hold water. But more importantly, I don't think that I think the fact that this issue comes up tells us just how far out of the mainstream of American foreign policy this policy is. President Reagan engaged with the Soviet Union. President Nixon engaged with China. Presidents of both parties have engaged with all kinds of governments that are not particularly nice, and where we have very, very vast differences in terms of our security interests and our values, and about things like human rights practices. And I don't think that that President Reagan's trips to the Soviet Union, his walking around Moscow with Gorbachev, anything like that, and I think no one would say that President Reagan was legitimizing the Soviets or their system.
Thank you.
And while this embargo has been coined the longest and most comprehensive embargo in the world, the embargo has failed to change the regime, which was the whole purpose of the embargo. And basically, it's resulted in the poverty of the Cuban people. It has cost the U.S. billions in potential exports. Okay, if we move on to the U.S. versus Syria, in August of 2011, President Barack Obama invoked sanctions against Syria, basically freezing their assets, freezing the import of Syrian oil, and forbidding Americans to invest in Syria or conduct business with their government. And the European Union actually joined in those sanctions, basically banning Syrian oil imports. And we say, well, why is that a big deal? Well, because Syria, basically 95% of their oil exports went to Europe. So when Europe said, we're not taking any more of your oil, basically there are numbers that say it just decimated their economy, about 75% of their gross national product.
I have met a lot of Syrians who have told me that even if the war is about to be ended, that they want to leave because they have no water. They don't have the basic necessities for life. Syria was one of those states in the Arab world whose standard of living had become comparable to that of Western European countries. It was completely self-supporting in terms of food supplies, and the conditions prevailing in the field of health were fine. For instance, 95% of kids were all getting vaccination. Nowadays, the situation has considerably worsened. The unemployment rate, which was about 8%, is now over 50%. The rate of growth, which was about 4.5% per year per capita, has now become a rate of impoverishment. I have recommended that the money that is frozen, the state resources that have been frozen by international banks, be unfrozen to import wheat in order to ensure the survival of the population.
But in spite of all of the sanctions against Syria, it didn't result in overthrowing the Assad government, which was the whole purpose of the sanctions. So when we talk about the ethics of war or the reasons for doing economic sanctions, the reason you do economic sanctions is to get target state or government to discontinue what they're doing. But if we're seeing that historically only 34% of the time there's a success rate, in these cases, many times there's no success rate at all, The human cost is what we have to look at when people can't get medications, when the supply chains are disrupted and people can't get food, when you look at the environmental impact of wastelands that are left because of bombing and the dismantling of infrastructures and people being dislocated and placed in refugee camps. And if you've ever seen a refugee camp, trust me, that's not a place where you want people to live, or citizens, millions of citizens displaced. Now you could say, well, the only other alternative is a war. But I guess I would suggest to you that you have death, whether there's war or whether there's sanctions. And so, unfortunately, the people that are hurt the most when there's sanctions are the people. So I think that there has to be a conscious effort when people are sanctioned, that supports are put in place to support the people. And so when you see refugee camps being set up, or when we know these things are happening, the humanitarian aid and those systems have to be put in place to understand it's the people who suffer. It's not the oligarchs. It's not the elite. It's not the government officials many times. It's the people. And so we as a people have to decide, as a nation of people who abide by laws and humanitarian efforts, the cost of life because of our inability to be able to use diplomacy is something that I think we're going to grapple with for time to come. We can't say it's not problematic. There is a human cost to war, whether that be through sanctions or whether that be through bombing. People die.
They started shooting each other and they started fighting in our area where it led to 5 people died. They're just killing people who are innocent.
Bong kirungo hululuyong peji beri kang kidenyo ladi ndak mutama tanin dokata nang leleng ahi kang kadi jikyo e pondati nasango kololingi hele hinda hak
Ijanda busuk banda makone aku inyo to dilo busida ko ulu jadi aku bangkuat kone
ilo area lang munggat punya bawah aja deh kaju julo
lo urjanya
mà ngọt lo nghĩ mình sinh phải có because kan ni kita jengkang nang ma tui pupukin di berik ngọt nangi
ni juga di nyok na kilo hinan kag anggo ko ni tina diri te nyok ni kan
mutu hulu dunga ho wale la dume dunga ni dunga ngaji la ilo gba kulo jiki la dume jujuga o jiki
walai live lasa mana tu madang bonge gairo do because piong mana kan do je be ata be piong logam madang soya bong ki kolin kolo alorok like ka jelu ko ka je piong mana ay ngonda kang ni because arabat kolo det bay kolin katani
yala nkata ho mana nyili olobon kani ponda gele peng lo ayan la peng lo he ho twan nyolo no ha hilu nyututu nyono ha jelu
togolon nenek na nagong met paring na kanang gringin yo ge ban
ngo hilo wo ko bong nyana gere nan ko ke ni mai na taban kak yo popon da bong marani hu hunde hiure ne muskila bain
So we can see that she's really thirsty, which shows a sign that she's already mildly dehydrated. So she's got a dip in her skull here, which is just another sign for us that she might be slightly dehydrated as well. And we just need to encourage the mum to give as many as much oral fluids as possible.